Welcome, listener, in the shadows. We bring stories into the light. Join me as we explore the encounters no one speaks of and the things that watch from the dark. Before we dive into tonight's terrifying tale, a quick question. Do you dare wear the fear? Our exclusive Shadows merch is here. Hoodies, tees, and more, designed for those who embrace the darkness. Get yours before they vanish forever. Link below. The Blackwood Experiment, Day 1. The invitation. Dr. Neil Carter had spent years chasing shadows. His once promising career as an evolutionary biologist had crumbled under the weight of his own ambitious theories. He had risen to the top of his field with his groundbreaking work on forced evolution, proposing that human beings could push the boundaries of their biology through controlled mutations. His ideas had been revolutionary, but they had been dismissed by the scientific community as unethical, too far beyond acceptable scientific practice. The grants dried up. The prestigious institutions rejected his papers. His colleagues turned their backs on him. And now, here he was, barely scraping by as a lecturer at a second-rate university. The world had forgotten him, and he had retreated into obscurity. But deep down, Neil knew that he wasn't the only one searching for answers. Somewhere, someone shared his obsession with what lay beyond the boundaries of human biology. He could feel it, an unshakable conviction that the truth, hidden away in the shadows, was out there waiting for him to uncover it. And then the letter arrived. It came on an ordinary Tuesday, a thick, unmarked envelope sitting on the corner of his desk. There was no return address, no insignia, just the feeling that something wasn't quite right about it. At first, he thought it was just another unsolicited research offer, or perhaps one of those mysterious grant proposals that had become so common in his line of work. But when he opened it, the weight of the paper and the chilling simplicity of the message made his heart race. Inside was a single sheet, its edges yellowed and creased. The message was brief, its contents precise, unsettling. "We left something behind. We need to know if it's still there." There was no name, no explanation, just a set of coordinates and a date. A promise of answers, but no guarantee that they would be anything Neil wanted to hear. His mind raced. The coordinates led to an abandoned research facility deep in the Appalachian Mountains. Blackwood Facility. The place had been abandoned decades ago after a classified research project went horribly wrong. Neil had heard the rumors, whispers of failed experiments, of things that should never have been experimented with, but those were just stories, nothing substantial. But someone thought differently. Someone wanted him to find out the truth. He didn't even need to look at the other names to know he wasn't going alone. The flight was uncomfortable, as most flights were. It had been years since Neil had traveled for anything but the most mundane reasons, and this trip felt like an unavoidable plunge into something he couldn't control. The passenger seats felt cramped and the air recycled, a thin reminder that the outside world had its own rules he had spent years ignoring. But he wasn't going to let fear consume him now. He glanced across the aisle at the others who had been invited. First, there was Dr. Evelyn Brooks, a molecular biologist whose reputation had been ruined when she exposed the illegal human trials funded by a private corporation. She had uncovered horrors, test subjects altered beyond recognition, but she had paid the price for speaking out. There was nothing left for her now but this. Evelyn was as driven as Neil, though in a very different way. She had once been hailed as a rising star, but now she was a ghost of that person. Her eyes, once bright with curiosity, now held a darkened intensity, as if she had seen the worst humanity had to offer and was determined to understand it. Then there was Lucas Ward, an investigative journalist whose obsession with government conspiracies had made him as paranoid as he was brilliant. Lucas had spent years chasing down classified files, piecing together stories no one was supposed to know. He had lost friends, colleagues, even family members to the pursuit of truth. But the truth, as it turned out, was always a moving target. Lucas's eyes were restless, his fingers constantly tapping on his phone as if he were afraid that someone, or something, might be watching. Finally, there was Marcus Hale, the ex-military survivalist, a hulking man with a cold stare that said everything. Marcus had been hired for his expertise in extraction operations, the kind of man who could keep his head down when bullets were flying, who could live off the land and move through chaos with a single-minded purpose. Neil had no idea why someone like Marcus would accept an invitation to something like this. The man didn't speak much, but when he did, it was always to take charge, to push them forward, never to look back. The flight took them across the country, through layers of clouds, over endless stretches of forests and mountains. Each hour dragged on, and Neil could feel the weight of the invitation pressing against him. What had they signed up for? What had they just agreed to? When they landed, the fog of the mountain air wrapped around them like a shroud, thick and unnatural. The temperature was cooler here, as though the mountain had its own weather system, one that didn't play by the rules. As they stepped off the small propeller plane and onto the tarmac of an old, abandoned airport, Neil noticed the quiet. The kind of silence that settled deep into your bones and made the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. Even the birds seemed to have gone silent. The driver who had been arranged for them was already waiting, standing by a nondescript van with tinted windows. He was a tall, gaunt man, his face hidden beneath a weathered cap. His eyes, though sharp, betrayed nothing. "We'll be driving for a few hours," he said, his voice rough, almost a whisper. "It's not easy to get to Blackwood, and if you hear it, don't answer." "It?" Evelyn asked, her voice sharp with curiosity. The driver didn't answer. He simply opened the back of the van and gestured for them to get in. Neil glanced at his companions. The unease was spreading now. They were all thinking the same thing. What in God's name had they gotten themselves into? They climbed into the van, the engine humming to life as the wheels turned over the cracked pavement and the path to Blackwood began. As the van rumbled through the dense woods, the trees closed in around them, dark and suffocating. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. No one spoke. The world outside seemed to slip away, as if they were being pulled into some pocket of time where the laws of nature didn't apply. Neil felt something then, a shift, an eerie calm that settled over the van. It was a silence that had been waiting, that had been there long before they arrived. And in the distance, through the cracks in the trees, he saw it. The dark silhouette of Blackwood Facility, standing tall and desolate in the distance. They had arrived. Day 2. The descent, the journey into the Appalachian wilderness, felt like they were being swallowed whole by the earth itself. The path to Blackwood Facility was a forgotten trail, winding deeper and deeper into the untouched forest, where the trees grew too close together, their branches gnarled and clawing at the air like twisted hands. The road had disappeared long ago, leaving only overgrown brush and rocks to guide them. Every so often, the sun pierced through the dense canopy above, casting sharp, fleeting beams of light that illuminated the crawling vines, but the darkness below remained thick, oppressive. Neil couldn't shake the feeling that the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. The air here felt wrong, heavy and stagnant, pressing in on him from all sides. It wasn't just the isolation of the place. It was something more primal, something that gnawed at the edges of his thoughts. The truck bumped and scraped along the uneven terrain as they moved deeper into the woods, the thick forest growing thicker, the ground beneath them increasingly treacherous. The only sounds were the low rumble of the engine and the occasional screech of birds hidden in the thick branches. Even the wind seemed to have fallen silent here, as though the forest had long since stopped sharing its secrets with the outside world. Marcus, sitting at the front with the driver, didn't speak much. He was a man of few words, his thoughts often hidden behind his steely, unreadable expression. But as they drove, Neil noticed the way he would glance over his shoulder now and then, his eyes scanning the forest behind them. It wasn't just a tactical habit. Marcus was on edge, his every muscle coiled tight like a spring ready to snap. Evelyn sat next to Neil in the back of the truck, her body tense, but her eyes were fixed ahead, as though she was bracing herself for something inevitable. She had been quiet ever since they'd left the airport, but Neil knew that she was as curious as he was. The years of whispered rumors about Blackwood had etched themselves into her mind, her scientific curiosity about the place battling with the strange feeling in the pit of her stomach. The moment Lucas had shown up, offering his services as a journalist, There had been something off about him. He had an intensity in his eyes, a kind of recklessness that Neil found unsettling. Lucas had been obsessed with government cover-ups and shady research programs, and something told Neil that this trip wasn't just about uncovering the truth. It was a quest for something more personal. When they hit the final stretch, the truck slowed, the forest thinning out slightly. Through the windshield, Neil could just make out the silhouette of something ahead, something looming like a shadow against the pale sky. And then it appeared. Blackwood Facility. At first, it looked like nothing more than a crumbling monument to a forgotten past. The buildings were barely visible through the thick trees and vines that had overtaken them. Faded metal walls, rusted steel doors, and broken windows stared out at them like the hollow eyes of a long-dead creature. The perimeter fence, long since broken and collapsed, lay tangled in overgrowth. As the truck came to a halt, the weight of it all hit Neil like a punch to the gut. There it was. Blackwood. He climbed out of the truck, his boots sinking slightly into the soft, wet ground. The air had an unnatural stillness to it now, as if the trees themselves had ceased their quiet murmuring in fear of what they were about to witness. The only sound was the soft rustle of the leaves underfoot, the occasional snap of a twig breaking under their weight. It felt as though they were the first people to set foot here in years. Marcus jumped out first, his boots crunching the dry ground as he looked around with a practiced, wary eye. "This place, it's been abandoned for a long time," he muttered, a slight unease in his voice. "The kind of decay you don't get unless something happened here, something bad." Evelyn didn't respond immediately. She was too focused on the rusted signage that had barely held up to the test of time. The faded biohazard warnings, their jagged edges peeling and curling like paper caught in the rain. She moved closer to the walls, her fingers grazing the surface, almost reverently. "How did they just leave all of this?" she whispered. "What happened here? Was there a fire? A containment breach?" Neil stepped forward, his eyes scanning the facility. Something felt off about the place. The shadows were too deep. The silence stretched too long. It was as if the world had forgotten Blackwood, leaving it to rot in a state of suspended animation, waiting for someone, anyone, to finally disturb it. "Let's go inside," Lucas said, his voice eager, yet strained. He stepped forward and tried the door, which was slightly ajar, its once imposing metal frame now warped and bent by years of neglect. The door creaked on its hinges, an eerie sound that echoed in the still air. As they crossed the threshold, Neil could feel the temperature drop. It wasn't a sudden shift, but it was noticeable, almost as if the facility itself exhaled, a cold breath sweeping over them. Inside was darker than expected, the light from the broken windows barely filtering through the thick layers of grime. A damp smell clung to the air, along with something more metallic, something that made Neil's skin prickle with unease. The interior was worse than he had imagined. The hallway stretched endlessly ahead of them, walls lined with peeling white tiles. The floors were slick with moisture, and the faintest traces of old blood stained the grout between the tiles. In the far distance, the faint echo of dripping water could be heard, the sound reverberating through the empty halls like a mocking reminder of life that had long since fled. They stepped further into the building, the darkness swallowing them with each step. Neil reached for his flashlight, the beam slicing through the gloom. It landed on what looked like an abandoned laboratory, its counters cluttered with overturned equipment, shattered vials, and dried stains that resembled old blood. Evelyn's breath hitched. This isn't just a research facility," she muttered, more to herself than to anyone else. This was a place of experimentation, but the kinds of things they were researching, no one should have ever been allowed to conduct this kind of work. Lucas stepped forward, his eyes flicking to the shelves on the far wall, where rows of overturned glass containers had fallen and shattered. "What kind of experiments?" he asked, his voice sharp with both curiosity and growing unease. Evelyn paused, her eyes flicking over the remains of the lab. "Genetic manipulation," she whispered. "Mutation. They were trying to accelerate evolution, pushing the human body beyond its limits. They didn't care about the consequences. They were playing with forces they didn't understand." Neil felt his stomach drop. He was beginning to piece it all together. They hadn't just been studying diseases or the human body's resistance to illness. They had been trying to change something fundamental about life itself. And whatever it wasn't just theory anymore. The scars left on these walls were the evidence of something far darker. "We need to find more answers," Evelyn said, finally breaking the silence. She stood up, her eyes filled with the kind of determination that Neil had seen in her before. "We're not leaving here until we know what happened." As they made their way deeper into the facility, Neil couldn't shake the feeling that something had never truly left, that the thing they were hunting wasn't hidden in a file or on a screen. It was still here, waiting. Day 3, the awakening, the silence in Blackwood Facility was unbearable. The deeper they moved into the heart of the complex, the more suffocating it became. The air was thick, dense with the stench of something old, something ancient. The smell of decay was unmistakable, but underneath it lingered something else, a faint, metallic tang that made Neil's stomach twist with unease. He tried to shake off the feeling, but it clung to him like a shadow. Evelyn led the group as they navigated the darkened hallways, her flashlight beams slicing through the heavy gloom. Her movements were measured, deliberate, yet there was an edge of anxiety in her steps. It was clear that even she, with all her years of experience in research facilities, was feeling the weight of the place. "This place," she trailed off, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's like time doesn't exist here, like it's stuck, trapped in whatever happened." Neil didn't respond immediately. He couldn't. The truth was, he was beginning to wonder if Evelyn was right. The longer they stayed, the more it felt like they were walking through some kind of suspended nightmare. A place untouched by time, sealed off from the outside world for reasons they still didn't fully understand. The dim emergency lights flickered above them, casting long, crooked shadows along the walls. Neil's eyes kept darting to the corners of the hall, as if expecting something, or someone, to emerge from the dark. They passed room after room, each one more abandoned than the last. In one, old lab equipment lay scattered across the floor, half assembled. Faded chalkboards were still covered in equations, some of which made no sense to Neil. They were half erased, as if someone had been interrupted mid-thought. On the floor, a tattered notebook was open to a page filled with drawings that looked like diagrams of human anatomy. Only they were twisted, distorted, as though the human form was being stretched and warped into something unnatural. Evelyn crouched down to examine it. These looked like experiments. They were trying to force something, push the boundaries of what the human body could withstand. Her voice trembled as she spoke. They thought they could evolve it, improve it. "You mean mutate it?" Lucas interjected bitterly from behind them. His face was pale, his camera still in his hands, though he no longer seemed interested in filming. His attention was fixed on the grotesque drawings that Evelyn had found. This place, they weren't trying to evolve anything. They were playing God. Neil turned to face him, "And now we're stuck in their mess." The words had barely left his mouth when the low hum of a nearby generator vibrated beneath their feet. The noise came from somewhere deep within the facility, unmistakable, a sound they'd been hearing in the background for hours now. It was the heartbeat of the complex, the only sign of life left in a place that should have been long dead. But as they ventured further, the hum grew louder, almost pulsing. It became a rhythm, a beat that seemed to vibrate through the very walls. Neil could feel it in his chest, the steady thrum of the generator, and it began to take on a strange, ominous significance. "This way," Evelyn said, leading them down another corridor. There was a sense of urgency in her tone now, a subtle shift in her demeanor. She was no longer speaking with the clinical detachment she had earlier, but with a nervous energy, like someone desperately trying to outrun a feeling they couldn't shake. "Where are we going?" Marcus asked, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. He had been uncharacteristically quiet, his gaze sweeping the hallways as if he expected something to jump out at them at any moment. But even he seemed to recognize the change in atmosphere. There was no longer just the weight of silence in the air. Something was watching them, listening. "We need to find the control room," Evelyn said, her voice low, almost urgent. "The system's here, whatever's left of them. They should give us access to whatever happened here. Maybe we can understand it. Maybe we can understand what they were doing." They continued down the corridor, their footsteps the only sound in the dead facility. Neil felt like they were being swallowed by the darkness, the oppressive weight of the place pushing down on them with every step they took. They reached a large door at the end of the hall. It was a steel-reinforced blast door, heavily rusted but still standing strong. It was the only door in the entire facility that hadn't been overtaken by time, and it was locked. Evelyn hurried to a control panel beside the door, her fingers dancing over the aged buttons, her face tense with concentration. The others stood back, watching her, waiting. "I can't get it open," Evelyn muttered under her breath. She looked up, her brow furrowed in frustration. "It's locked down. Something's triggered a security system. I need to bypass it." As she worked, Neil felt a sudden surge of unease. He couldn't explain why, but he was certain that something was wrong. The sense of being watched was now overpowering, like eyes were on him from all directions. He took a step back, instinctively glancing over his shoulder. A shadow. For a split second, he saw it out of the corner of his eye, a shape, just out of reach, moving in the periphery of his vision. He spun around, heart hammering in his chest, but there was nothing. Nothing but empty hallway and the flickering emergency lights. "You all right, Neil?" Lucas asked, his voice laced with concern. "I thought I saw something," Neil admitted, though the words felt foolish even as he said them. He tried to shake the feeling, tried to focus on the task at hand, but the dread in his chest was only growing. Before he could respond further, Evelyn's voice broke through the tension. "Got it!" she exclaimed. The blast door slid open with a low, mechanical groan, revealing a narrow passageway beyond. "This way." They stepped into the darkened corridor, and almost immediately the air seemed to shift. The temperature dropped. The hum of the generator seemed to fade, leaving a suffocating stillness in its place. The walls here were covered in what appeared to be dried blood, splattered in chaotic patterns. The floor was slick with something darker, something that had been there far too long. They moved cautiously, their flashlights cutting through the thick darkness. The passage led them to a small room, its walls lined with strange, half-destroyed equipment. But at the center of the room stood a large observation window. Neil stepped forward, drawn to it, and that's when he saw it. Behind the glass was a holding cell, empty, save for a single chair bolted to the floor. But the real horror was what lay etched into the glass. A pattern, a series of symbols that had been scratched into the surface, deep and jagged. It looked like writing, human writing. "They're here," it read, over and over again. Before Neil could fully process the sight, there was a noise behind him, a loud, sickening crack. He turned, heart leaping into his throat, just as the lights flickered, plunging them into complete darkness. Stay tuned for part 2. The ending will be sure to leave chills. If you like the story so far, comment below what you think's gonna happen next. You made it back for now. But the things in the dark never truly leave, do they? They watch, they wait, and perhaps they remember you now too. If you want to hear more, if you dare to listen again, step back into the shadows. Like the video, subscribe, but know this, some doors once opened do not close so easily.